The meeting room aboard the Xylovian space station was pristine. Gleaming surfaces, sharp angles, and an air of quiet grandeur that seemed almost too perfect, like something out of a dream. Sarah Chen felt a slight unease as she took her seat at the long, luminous table, surrounded by dignitaries from all corners of Earth. The Xylovians were a mystery, their technology so far beyond humanity's that it left an unsettling feeling in the pit of her stomach. Still, this was history in the making, Earth's first contact with an advanced species. The Xylovian ambassador, Korak, stood at the head of the table, his features serene yet distant, like a being who had seen it all. He began explaining their purpose, a hopeful speech about cooperation and the exchange of knowledge. His words were rich with promise, and yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way the room seemed to shimmer in her peripheral vision, or the way the air felt just a little too thick, almost as though it were alive. Then it happened. Korak's hands hovered over a panel on the table, and a holographic projection burst to life in the center of the room, displaying a map of the galaxy. It was breathtaking the way the stars seemed to pulse with a quiet rhythm, like the heartbeat of the universe itself. But as Sarah watched, she noticed something strange. The projection flickered, a brief distortion, a ripple in the air. It was so subtle that at first she thought she had imagined it. But then the table beneath her hands vibrated. A low hum filled the room, and the projection twisted, like a page torn from a book and hastily repaired. The room seemed to flicker between its pristine form and something more fluid. Sarah felt her breath catch as the edges of the walls wavered, the floor slightly buckling as if gravity itself had momentarily forgotten its place. Korak's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. He spoke quickly in a language that sounded like music, an alien dialect Sarah had only just begun to understand. But the hum grew louder, as if the entire station were caught in a strange resonance. "It's nothing," Korak said, his voice betraying a thin layer of tension. "Just a system recalibration. Nothing to worry about." But Sarah's mind raced. She hadn't imagined it. She wasn't the only one who had felt it. Earth's representatives exchanged wary glances, their discomfort now palpable. Something was wrong. The air itself seemed to shift, warping and bending like the reflection in a cracked mirror. The hum reached a crescendo, and then, with a suddenness that took her breath away, the entire room froze. The holographic stars above their heads seemed to pause, suspended in mid-motion as though reality itself had momentarily lost its way. The lights dimmed, and for a heartbeat, Sarah thought she saw the stars flicker, shifting, moving against their natural paths as though they were not stars at all but mere projections. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything snapped back into place. The table steadied, the projection resumed its steady pulse, and the hum faded. But Sarah could feel it, an unsettling tension in the air, a quiet warning that she couldn't explain. Korak cleared his throat. "As I said, just a brief malfunction. Shall we continue?" But Sarah wasn't listening. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced around, trying to gauge whether anyone else had witnessed the same thing. No one spoke up. No one seemed to notice the distortion, or if they did, they were careful not to mention it. But Sarah knew what she'd felt. Something had shifted, something deep within the very fabric of the station's reality, and for the first time she realized that humanity had just encountered something far more dangerous than advanced technology. They had encountered a force they couldn't control. Over the following days, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter aboard the Xylovian space station had been more than just a technical glitch. The distortion had been too real, too tangible, and it lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't escape. She hadn't spoken about it to anyone. After all, the Xylovians had dismissed it so quickly. But her instincts told her something far more profound was at play. It was during a debriefing session in the human delegation's quarters that the first sign of the strange phenomena returned. Sarah sat in a conference room with Dr. Alara, a renowned physicist who had been part of the delegation, and Commander Aidan Blake, a military strategist who had been tasked with assessing the Xylovian technology. They were reviewing data from the station, trying to make sense of the systems they'd been shown, but it was hard to focus. The odd, unshakable feeling still lingered. "Did anyone else notice the gravity fluctuation earlier?" Ilara asked, her voice low, almost uncertain. Sarah's head snapped up. "Gravity?" she repeated, her pulse quickening. Ilara nodded, tapping a few keys on her tablet. "It was subtle. Too subtle to be a malfunction. But when I was walking near the engineering bay, I felt lighter. Like I was, what's the word? Floating." Sarah frowned, her brow furrowing. "That's impossible. The Xylovians have technology that manipulates gravity. It must have been some kind of localized field." "Maybe," Ilara said, but her voice was skeptical. Except it wasn't a field. It was internal. My body felt different. Like I wasn't just experiencing a change in gravity, but was somehow altering it. Sarah's mind raced. This wasn't just a malfunction. It was something deeper, something human. Later that evening, as Sarah walked through the station, she experimented with what Ilara had described. She reached out to touch a railing along a corridor and, without thinking, concentrated on the sensation of weightlessness. It wasn't much at first, just a slight easing of her muscles, a faint pull on her body. But then, just like that, the air around her seemed to shimmer, and she was floating, rising effortlessly off the floor. Her breath caught in her throat. She quickly planted her feet back on solid ground, her heart pounding. The sensation was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but she couldn't deny what had just happened. Had I done that? Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The anomalies, the distortions in the meeting room, the strange sensations in the air. It wasn't just technology malfunctioning. It was something far more dangerous. The ability to manipulate reality itself. And humanity had done it. She couldn't help but wonder if they'd all been so focused on the Xylovians' technology that they had failed to notice the dormant potential within themselves. What if humans weren't just observers of the universe, but active participants, creators, capable of shaping the world around them? Sarah's thoughts spiraled as she realized the implications of what she had just discovered. She wasn't the only one affected by this. Dr. Ilara had felt it too. And it wasn't just gravity. There had been those odd moments, those fleeting instances where time had seemed to stretch, where objects had moved without cause, where the laws of physics had wavered like a dream. The station's environment wasn't malfunctioning. It was responding to them. But who or what was guiding this power? She knew she had to speak to Ilara to figure out what was really happening before it was too late. But as she turned the corner, ready to seek her out, she froze. A faint ripple in the air shimmered before her eyes. It was subtle, like the flicker of a distant star, but unmistakable. Reality itself seemed to waver just for a moment, and then it was gone. She blinked, heart racing. Her mind was no longer just grappling with the idea of human potential. It was becoming something else, something far more dangerous than either she or the Xylovians could have imagined. The universe, she realized, was no longer as solid as it had once seemed. The days that followed were a blur. Sarah tried to focus on the task at hand, meeting with the Xylovian leaders, analyzing their technology, and fostering peaceful relations. But the strange events haunted her every waking moment. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the shimmer in the air, felt the subtle tug of gravity shifting, and heard the low hum beneath the surface of reality. It was as if the world was no longer as solid as it had once been. And with each passing moment, she realized that she was no longer just an observer in the universe. She had become part of it in a way she couldn't yet understand. It was Ilara who finally made the breakthrough. "Sarah," Ilara said one morning, her face pale as she hurried into Sarah's quarters. "I found something. It's a message. An ancient text. I think it's a key to understanding what's happening." Sarah looked up from her terminal, where she had been attempting to analyze a strange pattern in the station's data. The text had been buried in the ancient human artifacts the Xylovians had shared with them, one of the few items not fully translated. "What do you mean, a key?" she asked, rising from her seat. Alara nodded, hands shaking as she opened a Mado, small worn tablet. "I found this in the archives. It's written in an old language, but I was able to make sense of parts of it. The message speaks of humanity's true nature, and how our species is linked to something beyond mere existence, something called the Source. It's described as a power that allows us to shape and rewrite the very fabric of reality." Sarah's pulse quickened. The Source. The words felt like a weight in her chest, like the beginning of a revelation that could unravel everything. "What does it say about this power? How do we control it?" Ilara's face was drawn, her voice trembling. "That's the problem. The text is incomplete, but from what I can gather, it suggests that humanity's ability to alter reality has always existed. It's not something new. We've just forgotten how to wield it. The message hints that the power comes from within us, from our minds, our emotions, our collective will. And when it's awakened, it can either create or destroy." "Create or destroy," Sarah whispered. The implications were overwhelming. If this power was truly within them, untapped, forgotten, then humanity was sitting on a potential greater than any technology or weapon the Xylovians could ever offer. But what if it was too much? What if it couldn't be controlled? Alara closed the tablet with a snap, her eyes meeting Sarah's. "I think this is why the Xylovians are so concerned. They've encountered other civilizations with similar abilities, and they've seen what can happen when they fall into the wrong hands." Sarah's mind raced. "So you're saying the Xylovians fear us because they know what we're capable of? That's why they've been so careful around us?" Alara nodded. "Yes, and they're right to be afraid. We don't understand how to control it, Sarah. If we keep experimenting, we risk undoing everything. Reality itself could collapse." Sarah's thoughts were a whirlwind. Could humanity truly possess such power? And if so, what kind of civilization would they become? Would they be able to wield this power responsibly? Or would they, like the Xylovians feared, destroy themselves? Before she could respond, a sudden tremor shook the station, throwing Sarah off balance. The walls around them warped for just a moment, like a ripple passing through water. Then, as quickly as it had started, the tremor passed. Alara stared at her in shock. "That wasn't just a glitch, was it?" Sarah shook her head, fear gripping her. "No, that was us. We're causing this." The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. They weren't just accidentally altering reality anymore. They were actively reshaping it, and it was only a matter of time before the consequences of their actions would spiral out of control. "We have to stop this," Sarah said, her voice firm with resolve. "Before it's too late." The following morning, Sarah and Alara met with Korak and the other Xylovian leaders in a private chamber. The mood was tense, far more serious than it had been during their earlier meetings. Sarah could sense it in the way the Xylovians' stoic expressions seemed to tighten, their eyes narrowing as they exchanged guarded glances. Something had changed, something they weren't telling her. Korak was the first to speak, his voice calm but laced with an unmistakable tension. "We are aware of the disturbances you have been experiencing, Ambassador Chen," he began, his eyes sharp, focusing on Sarah. "And we fear it is no coincidence." Sarah's heart skipped. She hadn't expected them to address it so directly, and yet here they were, acknowledging the very thing that had unsettled her since her first encounter with the station's bizarre glitches. "What do you mean?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral, though her mind raced with the possibilities. "What are you really trying to say?" Korak exchanged a brief look with his fellow delegates before continuing. "Your species, humans, possess a power unlike any other we have encountered. We believe that you are not only capable of manipulating your reality, but that this power is ancient, dormant, and most importantly, dangerous." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Dangerous? Alara asked, her voice betraying her disbelief. How? We haven't even begun to fully understand it. Korak's expression remained unchanged. We have encountered other species in the galaxy, advanced civilizations that possessed similar abilities. At first, they were cautious, as you are, exploring their newfound powers, but in time they lost control. They altered their realities in ways that were catastrophic. Worlds were unmade. Entire civilizations crumbled. We have seen what happens when this power goes unchecked. Sarah couldn't help but feel a rush of disbelief. You're telling me that every civilization capable of such things has destroyed itself? Korak nodded gravely. Not everyone, but enough. The pattern is clear. The danger is not merely in the ability to alter reality, but in the temptation to use it, the urge to reshape one's existence, to push boundaries. This is what leads to chaos. And if humanity does not learn to control this power, you too will face the same fate. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her chest. So, what? You want us to stop exploring this power entirely? Not entirely, Korak said, his voice softening slightly. But you must understand the consequences of your actions. This is why we've offered our guidance, to help you understand the potential for good and the danger of becoming consumed by it. He paused, his gaze steady. But time is of the essence. The more you experiment with these abilities, the harder it will be to rein them in. Ilara's voice was sharp. And why are you telling us all this now? Why didn't you warn us sooner? Korak's eyes darkened. We did not believe you were ready, but now, it is clear you have awakened something within yourselves. We cannot afford to wait any longer. Sarah's mind reeled. They had barely scratched the surface of what was possible, and already the Xylovians were warning them of a path they might not be able to turn back from. But there was something else, something Korak wasn't telling them. Beneath the fear in his eyes, there was something deeper, a subtle trace of dread. Why are you really afraid? Sarah asked, her voice low. This isn't just about us, is it? For the first time, Korak hesitated. His gaze flickered to the window, out into the dark expanse of space beyond. Perhaps, he murmured, almost to himself, perhaps it is not only the destruction of your species we fear, but the rise of one far more powerful than ourselves. Sarah's blood ran cold as the weight of his words settled over her. It wasn't just humanity they were afraid of. It was what humanity could become. She couldn't help but wonder, were the Xylovians truly here to help? Or was there something more to their caution? Were they concerned about losing their dominance, or was there an even darker secret they were hiding? One thing was clear. Humanity had just unlocked a force far greater than any of them had realized. And the clock was ticking. The warnings from the Xylovians echoed in Sarah's mind like a drum beat, growing louder with every passing day. The power humanity had awakened, the ability to reshape reality itself, was no longer a secret. Sarah, Ilara, and the others were doing their best to control the newly discovered abilities, but each experiment, each attempt to understand their limits, only revealed more dangerous possibilities. It wasn't long before the divide began to form. At first it was subtle. A few influential political leaders began to express interest in humanity's potential, suggesting that they could use the power to secure global dominance. It was the kind of idealism Sarah had feared, the promise of utopia, the temptation to create a perfect world through the sheer force of will. But those same leaders began talking about bending reality to reshape economies, erase crime, and even control the weather, all with the flick of a mental switch. Commander Aiden Blake, who had once been Sarah's ally, was among them. The military. Strategists saw the possibilities as more than just an opportunity for peace. They were a means to ensure global superiority. If we can control reality, Aiden argued during a heated meeting, we can ensure that no nation ever threatens us again. We could prevent wars before they even start. Imagine an Earth without conflict, a world where suffering is eradicated by sheer will. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as Aiden spoke, the room's atmosphere heavy with the weight of his words. On the one hand, his vision of a utopian world was compelling, but on the other, it terrified her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the power to reshape reality could just as easily be used to oppress. What would stop one nation, one leader, from seizing control of this power and imposing their vision on the rest of humanity? She turned to Alara, whose face mirrored her own concern. "This is what the Xylovians were afraid of," Sarah whispered. "Unchecked power, no understanding of the consequences. If we don't stop this, we could be on the brink of something we can't undo." Alara nodded grimly. "I know, but it's already happening. People are starting to experiment on their own, using the power in private, and I've been hearing rumors. People are using it for personal gain." It wasn't just the political leaders. As the power spread through humanity, individuals began experimenting with reality-altering abilities in their everyday lives. People used it to create personal utopias, dreams realized at the cost of the world's balance. A wealthy CEO created a reality where he could never lose, never be touched by anything negative. A scientist used the ability to reverse her mother's illness, but at the cost of twisting the natural order of things in ways she couldn't comprehend. Sarah began to feel the weight of her responsibility growing heavier with each passing hour. What had started as an innocent curiosity, a desire to explore the unknown, had transformed into something much darker. Every day, more and more people pushed the limits of their abilities, and with every new experiment, the fabric of reality grew more fragile. The divide among humanity deepened. On one side, there were those who saw the power as a tool to create a better world, even if that meant bending the laws of nature to their will. On the other, there were those like Sarah, like Alara, who understood the risks and fought to maintain control to prevent humanity from spiraling into chaos. But as more people embraced their newfound abilities, their voices grew weaker, drowned out by the growing tide of desire for change, for perfection. "You have to understand, Sarah," Aiden said one evening, his voice tinged with frustration. "The potential is here. We can create anything, we can fix everything. Why stand in the way of that?" Sarah's heart sank as she looked at him, the man she had once trusted. "Because it's not that simple, Aiden. Power like this doesn't come without consequences. The Xylovians were right. We have to be careful. We can't control it if we let our desires control us." Aiden's expression hardened, and for the first time, Sarah saw something in his eyes that unsettled her. Ambition, a hunger that hadn't been there before. "Maybe you're right, but that doesn't mean we can't learn. Maybe the consequences aren't as bad as you think. Maybe we're just afraid." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She was no longer talking to her old friend. She was facing someone else, someone willing to gamble with the very fabric of existence for the sake of power. The line between creation and destruction had been drawn, and as the divide between those who sought to control this new reality grew wider, Sarah knew one thing for certain. The world was on the brink of something terrible, and there was no turning back. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the tension around Sarah thickened. The divide between the factions, those who believed in the responsible use of humanity's newfound abilities, and those who sought to reshape the world according to their own vision, had become irreparable. Sarah had once hoped for a peaceful resolution, but now it seemed as though the path to conflict was inevitable. Aiden's influence had grown rapidly. His charisma and persuasive arguments had won over more and more influential figures, both political and military. What had started as a handful of idealists had blossomed into a movement that saw the power to alter reality as the key to mankind's next evolutionary step. They didn't see the risks, only the potential, and that made them dangerous. Meanwhile, Sarah and Alara found themselves increasingly isolated. Every attempt to reason with the growing faction had been met with resistance. No one wanted to hear the warnings anymore. They saw Sarah's caution as fear, Alara's scientific analysis as pessimism, It was easier to believe in the possibility of utopia than to accept the harsh reality that power, unchecked, could corrupt everything it touched. It wasn't until the day of the mass demonstration that Sarah understood just how far things had gone. News reports flooded in, showing people in major cities all over the world using the power to alter their surroundings, to create idealized versions of their homes, to bend nature to their will, to erase suffering and pain. It started with small, seemingly harmless changes. People erasing traffic jams, healing injuries with a thought, turning back time to relive happy moments. But the more they used their powers, the greater their ambitions became. In one city, a leader had used the power to eliminate all poverty, transforming the entire population into a harmonious society, at least on the surface. But as Sarah watched the reports, a creeping dread took hold of her. She saw the faces of those who had become dependent on the new reality, living in a dream they didn't fully control, unable to see that the power they wielded was changing them. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, the first large-scale disaster occurred. In a political summit held in one of the major capitals, a group of government officials, part of Aiden's faction, tried to push the limits of their powers, seeking to rewrite the global economy and eliminate all corruption. But their attempts to create a perfect world had unintended consequences. One of the officials, attempting to erase greed from the human psyche, inadvertently caused a mass shift in perception. People's memories began to warp, and entire sections of the city dissolved into chaotic flashes of half-formed realities. Buildings vanished, replaced by illusions. People's minds fragmented, unsure of what was real and what had been rewritten. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a complete breakdown in the fabric of reality itself. The city was now caught in a nightmarish loop of constantly shifting states, like a painting that had been torn apart and reassembled in the wrong order. The images on the screen were horrific. Sarah felt a sickening twist in her gut as she realized what was happening. The power they had discovered was beyond their comprehension, and now it was unraveling everything. Aiden's voice had come through the broadcast, urgent and panicked. "We can fix this, we can fix it. Just think, and it will be made whole again." But the more he spoke, the more the scene descended into madness. The reality around them was falling apart, and no amount of willpower could put it back together. "That's what happens when you push too far," Ilara said quietly, her eyes glued to the screen. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, fear, and helplessness. This is what I was afraid of. They had crossed a line. Humanity had unleashed something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. There was no easy way out now. The world was teetering on the brink, and Sarah realized that if she didn't act, the consequences would be irreversible. But how could she stop it? How could they stop it when the power itself was so deeply embedded in every human being? The question haunted her as she watched the chaos unfold, knowing that the true battle was just beginning. This was no longer just about controlling power. It was about saving humanity from itself. The world was slipping through Sarah's fingers. The chaos caused by Aiden's faction had spread far beyond the city where it had begun. Reality itself was warping, unraveling at the edges, as more people tried to reshape their worlds, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the damage they were causing. What had started as an attempt to create perfection had turned into a global nightmare, and Sarah knew that if they didn't act fast, they might never be able to restore what was lost. The first step she knew was finding a way to stop the instability. The power humanity had tapped into was not just a tool, it was an unpredictable force, capable of destroying everything in its path if left unchecked. And despite what Aiden believed, it was far too dangerous to simply keep manipulating. They needed to reverse what had already been done, contain the power before it consumed them all. "How do we fix this, Sarah?" Ilara asked, her voice thick with desperation. She had been working nonstop, trying to decipher every shred of knowledge about this reality-altering power, but even she didn't have the answers anymore. "We've seen what happens when people push too far. But what if we've reached a point where it's irreversible?" Sarah shook her head, her thoughts racing. I don't know, Alara, but we have to try. We have to find a way to neutralize the influence before it spreads even further. She stood up abruptly, pacing the room. There has to be a way to tap into the source, our source, and shut it down. If we could control it, if we could understand it. Control it? Alara cut in. We don't even understand how it works, Sarah. How could we possibly control something like this? Sarah stopped, meeting Alara's gaze. She could see the doubt in her friend's eyes, and she felt it too. Every instinct told her that they were running out of time, but Sarah couldn't afford to give in to fear. If they didn't try something, humanity would continue spiraling into madness and there would be no going back. I don't know how to control it, Sarah admitted, but I think we're missing something the Xylovians knew but didn't tell us. What do you mean? Sarah hesitated, considering the fragmented information they had gathered. The Xylovians had spoken of the danger of humanity's power, but they had never fully explained how it could be stopped, or why they feared it so much. They had warned of the temptation to reshape reality, but had they known more? Had they kept something from them? I think the Xylovians have been hiding something, she said, voice low but determined. They know more about this power than they let on. We need to go back to them, ask them to explain everything. There has to be a way to sever the link between humanity and the source, to seal it before we destroy ourselves. Alara looked unsure but nodded slowly. You think they'll help us? After everything that's happened? I don't know, Sarah said, her voice firm. But we don't have a choice. If we don't act now, humanity will either fall under the weight of its own creation, or worse, it will destroy everything. With no time to waste, Sarah and Alara made preparations to return to the Xylovian space station. The journey there was tense, each moment filled with the heavy weight of what was at stake. They had no guarantee that the Xylovians would welcome them, or that they even had the answers they needed. When they arrived at the station, the Xylovians were waiting. Korak, his face grim, led them into a secluded chamber where they could speak privately. You've come to ask the questions you should have asked long ago, Korak said, his tone cautious. But the truth is not something we share lightly, Ambassador Chen. You're asking for knowledge that could either save or doom your species. And we have already seen what happens when such power is misused. Sarah met Korak's gaze, her heart pounding. I understand the risks, but if we don't understand the full scope of what we've done, we'll never be able to stop it. We need your help, Korak. Korak sighed deeply, his eyes searching hers. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. You don't just control reality, he said quietly. You become it. The source is not a power to wield. It is a force that binds the fabric of existence itself. And once you've opened that door, it's not something you can easily close, but there is a way, though it comes at a cost. The gravity of his words struck Sarah like a blow. A cost. What was the price for stopping this madness? Would humanity be able to pay it? The room fell silent as Korak's words hung in the air. The realization of what he was saying began to settle over Sarah, and her heart clenched in her chest. A cost, she repeated, barely above a whisper. What kind of cost? Korak's gaze softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of sympathy in his alien eyes. The source is not a tool. It is a reflection of your collective consciousness, your desires, fears, and intentions. It cannot be turned off, like a switch. Once unlocked, it alters your reality and your perceptions permanently. There is no going back unless you sever the connection. Sarah felt a cold shiver creep down her spine. Sever it? How? Korak's voice grew more somber. The only way to do so is through sacrifice. The power of the source is bound to the very essence of your species. It thrives on your collective will and your desire for change. To undo what has been done, you must remove that connection. To sever humanity's link to the source, one individual must relinquish their ability to alter reality entirely. They must give up their own connection, their very ability to reshape the fabric of existence. A chill ran through Sarah's body. Are you saying that someone, one person, has to lose their power forever? Korak nodded. Yes. And that individual will be the only one capable of restoring balance. The power will fade from the rest of humanity, and reality will return to its natural state. But the person who sacrifices their connection will be forever bound to the source, unable to influence reality in any way. They will become a living anchor to the fabric of existence, serving as a safeguard to prevent humanity from ever regaining control over it. Ilara's face turned pale as she absorbed the weight of Korak's words. That's a heavy price. It's a life without choice, without freedom. No one would willingly do that. Not willingly, Korak agreed. But it is the only way. The source cannot be controlled by your kind without consequence. You have already seen the price of trying to manipulate it. It warps reality. It unravels everything. The temptation to use the source for your own benefit will always lead to destruction. The only way to protect humanity, and the rest of the universe, is for one person to bear the burden of keeping it in check. Sarah's mind was reeling. She had hoped for a solution, but this was a sacrifice that seemed unbearable. How could she or anyone make such a choice? Aiden's face flashed in her mind. His vision of a perfect world had been seductive, but he had been blind to the dangers of unrestrained power. Could he be the one to make this sacrifice? Could anyone? We can't just choose anyone, Sarah said, her voice trembling. It has to be someone who truly understands the cost. Someone who can accept the responsibility. Korak's eyes darkened. It will be a difficult decision, but the choice will ultimately come down to the individual. The one who steps forward to make the sacrifice will understand on a fundamental level what it means to bear that weight. Ilara looked at Sarah, her expression one of quiet understanding. Sarah, you don't have to do this. There's another way. We could keep trying to control it, find another solution. Sarah shook her head, her heart heavy. No, we've seen what happens when we keep pushing the limits. We've seen the damage. The only way to stop this is to give up what we've gained. The air between them felt thick with the realization of what had to be done. Sarah's heart pounded as she thought of the countless lives already lost, of the cities that had crumbled under the weight of the power they had unleashed. She could no longer ignore the truth. This power was not a gift. It was a curse. I'll do it, Sarah said, her voice steady, though the words felt like a stone lodged in her throat. I'll be the one to sever the connection. Ilara's eyes filled with tears. No, Sarah, you don't have to. I do, Sarah interrupted gently, her voice firm. It has to be me. I understand the consequences, and if I don't do this, we may not survive. Korak nodded, his expression unreadable. Then it is done. But know this. Once you make the sacrifice, you will never be able to return to your old life. You will be bound to the source, forever keeping it in check. It will be a life of isolation, of service to something far greater than yourself. Sarah took a deep breath, her resolve solidifying. This was the only way forward. For humanity. For the universe. It was the only way to restore balance before everything they had worked for fell apart. And so, with one final glance at her friends, she stepped forward into the unknown, prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. The source would be sealed, and humanity would have its future once again. One without the temptation of realities, reigns. But it would come at the price of Sarah's own freedom, a price she was willing to pay.